Welcome everybody to today's session. We're going to be talking about leveraging GRC and enterprise risk management. And my name is Dan Clark, and I, along with Juan Escano, who's the Chief Risk Officer of Zhorse, the enterprise risk and GRC solution. Zhorse makes GRC easy, and we thank them for their sponsorship of this. And today we are very, very lucky, and I am pleased to introduce you to Michael Rasmussen. And I am excited to hear this because Michael is a very active and sought out person when it comes to GRC. When I thought about this, I thought we kind of captured you, Michael, because you're so busy. You go to Europe, you go across the United States, you travel a lot, you're always on the phone. You've got great insight. So it's nice for us, and it's a great privilege for us to have you here today. I know that you have your own business. You are a GRC pundit and analyst, but I'd like you, maybe as I turn it over to you, to take just a minute to introduce yourself and your business and what you do, and then we'll just turn it over to you for the presentation today.
Certainly. I'm Michael Rasmussen, and as it was stated, I'm an analyst. And so I've got, just about 30 years of experience in this space. I guess it's 28 officially. The 90s was dedicated to IT risk, information risk, or security management. But I've got a business degree and a law degree, and it branched out from there to a lot of other areas of enterprise and operational risk and corporate compliance and ethics and audit and so forth. In the year 2000, I got hired by Gig Information Group, which got acquired by Forrester Research. I spent 7 years at Forrester as one of their top analysts. And I guess my claim to fame is on a cold, snowy day in the Chicago office in February 2002, 20 years ago, I defined and modeled the GRC market and labeled it GRC. So being the first to use the acronym, I've been called the father of GRC from that perspective. But left Forrester at the end of 2007 after writing the first couple, Forrester GRC waves, and have been 14 years on my own. As an analyst, I don't like to call myself a consultant, although you can say an aspect of what I do is advisory. But I'm an analyst. My job is research. I spend my time understanding what are the challenges that companies face in the context of governance, risk management, and compliance, and how do they go about solving those challenges with strategy, process, and technology. So my job is purely focused on researching the challenges organizations face and how they solve those challenges, particularly how they leverage technology like Zhorse to address that.
Excellent. That's going to be great for part 2 of our series here, Michael, because we've got some questions about GRC that we're going to ask. So I'm looking forward to that, but that's a great introduction. So we'll turn it over to you for the rest of the 40-50 minutes and let you educate all of us on GRC.
Excellent. Well, today's organization, doesn't matter if you're small or large, what you're doing is navigating chaos. Today's organization is very dynamic. It's changing minute by minute, second by second. Think about it, like financial services firms, laws and regulations. If you look at Thomson Reuters' most recent figures, global financial services firms are dealing with 257 regulatory change events every business day. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, 52 weeks out of the year. Every business day on average, 257 regulatory change events each day coming from 1,217 regulators around the world. Approximately 1/3 of those are in North America. So maybe you're not a global financial services organization. Maybe you're just dealing with operations in the United States and Canada. That means about 80 to 85 of those regulatory change events are coming from North America every day. And so there's a lot to keep abreast on, whether it's federal regulators or state regulators. There's a lot of change happening. And it's not just new laws and regulations that make that number, but it's also the enforcement actions. The law itself or the regulation itself might not have changed, but how the regulators approach it and how they enforce it might change. And so those 257 regulatory change events include a significant number of developments and how it's being enforced as well. But it's just not the legal and regulatory change. It's also the risk change in geopolitical risk, economic risk that impacts things like credit risk policies and everything else for banks and credit unions and so forth. We have a lot of change in technology. 15 years ago, we're dealing with social media platforms and how do we deal with Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter for business purposes. 10 years ago was bring your own device policies. How do we deal with laptops and tablets and smartphones that are personal devices and not corporate devices, but being used for business purposes? Then the last several years has been the Internet of Things. And how do we deal with the microwave in the break room that's connected to the internet or whatever it might be? And now it's artificial intelligence. What are our policies and controls and risks related to artificial intelligence? So we have to deal with regulatory change. We have to deal with risk change. And again, that risk change could be economic risks, geopolitical risks, shifts in industry standards and practices, to shifts in technology. But on top of all this, you have to deal with a lot of change within the business itself. Think about it. Your employees are changing. You don't have the same employees that you did 6 months ago, 1 year ago, 2 years ago, maybe even last week. Employees are constantly changing. Processes are changing. Technology is changing in the organization. The organization is very dynamic. And not only is it dynamic, but the modern organization is an extended array of third-party relationships, vendors, supply chains, outsourcers, service providers, contractors, consultants, temporary workers, brokers, agents, dealers, intermediaries, and more. There is no hard black and white edge to the organization. It's shades of gray now. And those issues and those third parties, and you walk down the hall of like a financial services organization or other corporation, when we're not in lockdowns and we're all in the corporate office, half the people that you pass by are not employees. They are third parties. They are the contractors and temporary workers and consultants, and they're working on your systems and processes. And as much as your business is changing, their businesses are changing. They might have had all the right security controls and everything else to do business with 3 years ago, but are they today? And so the challenge is you have to keep all this change in sync. You have to keep the changing regulatory environment, risk environment, and business environment all in sync. And that's a challenge for organizations. I have a great article I wrote on this that was published in Enterprise Risk Magazine by the Institute of Risk Management in London. I'm a global ambassador of risk management, honorary life member for the IRM. And I publish articles with them frequently, but it was actually called Navigating Chaos, and this exact challenge in the dynamic, distributed, and disrupted nature of business today. But let's unpack risk a little bit. Now, I started my risk management career in the 1990s in IT security, and I still interact a lot with IT security. But I saw risk as something bad, something you didn't want. And we had to eliminate vulnerabilities and hackers and viruses and worms, oh my, and we had to address all this. But the reality is that risk is also a tool for the organization. And that's a perspective that took years for me to develop and understand. Teddy Roosevelt, US president, said, risk is like fire. If controlled, it will help you. If uncontrolled, it will rise up and destroy you. Risk can be used as a tool for or against the organization. John Paul Jones, a famous Revolutionary War naval hero. We know him for the saying, I have not yet begun to fight when being beaten up by a larger British frigate. He turned around and won that naval battle in one of the first big victories for the United States in its infancy. But he also stated, in the context of risk management back then, 250 years ago, it is a law of nature, inflexible and inexorable, that those who do not risk do not win. Risk is part of war. Risk is part of business. Risk is part of life. You go out now, you see signs that say, you enter this establishment, you're taking a risk that you might get COVID-19, but you weigh, do I walk in there? Do I go in there vaccinated or unvaccinated? Do I go in there without personal protective equipment like a mask or something? Everybody's a born risk taker and makes risk decisions. And some people are aggressive in taking risk and might even have great returns on it because they know how to manage that risk well. Others might be, very cautious risk takers. But that's all reflected in the risk personality of the organization. Finally, on this slide, another favorite quote. I love quotes and I love history. But Judge Mervyn Keene of South Africa, he's the author of the Keene 1, 2, 3, and soon to be Keene 4 reports on corporate governance. He stated that enterprise is the undertaking of risk for reward. Now you translate, the Queen's Commonwealth English to US English. Instead of enterprise is the undertaking of risk for reward, US English, businesses take risks to make money. That's what it's about. We take risk, but do we take the right risk? One of the challenges we face is the interconnectivity of risk today. The physicist Friedrich Capra stated, the more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent. The physicist here was talking about biological ecosystems, but he might as well have been talking about the modern organization. That the more we study the major problems or risks of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They're systemic risks, it means that they're interconnected and interdependent risks. COVID-19 is a stellar example. What starts off with a health and safety risk cascades and increases our IT security risk because of the work from home environment. I mean, look at me. I mean, I've been a home office worker for 25 years working for my home office, but now everybody's working for their home office, or has been at least. But you look around me, you know, my speaker in front of me is connected to the internet. My TV is connected, my wall outlet, my exercise bike, my blender in my kitchen is connected to the internet. I can program with my iPhone. I have no idea why I'd want to program my blender with my iPhone, but I can. Now, if any of these devices have some type of Trojan horse or backdoor installed, you know, that can compromise my home network. And this happens. I mean, think SolarWinds from a year ago, a Trojan horse, a backdoor that compromised corporate networks. You know, and so we have increased IT security risk. We have increased risk of fraud because of COVID-19. There's economic constraints. There's greater risk that people might commit fraud on their corporate expense reports and other things because they're under constraints. They're concerned about the economy. There's greater risk of bribery and corruption. U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, U.K. Bribery Act, SEP and DO in France. There's restrictions on import, export, limited government contracts. There's greater risk that somebody might bribe a foreign government official to expedite their goods through customs or to gain that government contract. We've increased risk of FCPA and other bribery and corruption regulations. We have increased risk of modern slavery. In our supply chain, those factories go dark, you know, and all of a sudden they're because of illness and they're being reopened with child labor and forced labor. I can go on and on. You know, COVID-19 has this cascading impact where one health and safety risks increases the risk in all these other areas. It's an interconnected risk environment. You know, conduct risk. We're on a Zoom and team meetings and things. People aren't in their the corporate conference room and they're sitting on these meetings and they're saying things that would never be allowed in a corporate building. Things across the line of harassment and discrimination because they think different rules apply because they're at home working. They're not in the corporate office. And so we've seen increased risk of harassment, discrimination. And now we have increased risk coming out of COVID of rogue policies where managers don't like the organization's policies on vaccines or personal protective equipment like masks and things. And they're rewriting policies, whether they think they need to be stricter or looser. And they're putting legal liability and exposure upon the organization because a policy communicated by a manager, even if it's a rogue policy, establishes a duty of care. It's an interconnected risk environment. It's a very complex, and we have to see these relationships of risks. What starts off with one risk, like in this case, the example of COVID-19 health and safety risk, cascades increase as all these other risk exposure. So we need to be able to manage risk. What is risk? Risk is the uncertainty on objectives. The ISO 31000 definition of risk, and ISO 31000 is the international risk standard out there. So ISO 31000 defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Risk is about uncertainty management. We have our business model and we're trying to hit objectives. Those can be entity level objectives like performance for the overall corporation. They can be division, department, process, project, or even asset level objectives. Like you have employee information or customer information. Well, that's an asset. And what are the objectives to that asset? How is it used and leveraged? But then also, how is it protected? Because there's a lot of privacy laws and values and ethics that go into that as well. So what are the objectives of the organization? And what's the uncertainty in achieving those objectives? So I put a lot of context on the overall approach and challenge of organizations in navigating chaos and what risk management is. Now, the title of this presentation is, you know, how do we leverage GRC to drive enterprise risk management? So let's look at the definition of governance, risk, and compliance. The official definition of GRC found in the OSEG GRC capability model, and I helped author this, is GRC is a capability that enables an organization to reliably achieve objectives. That's the governance function. You know, governance is about establishing and governing the achievement of the objectives of the organization. It can be corporate governance at the highest level. It could be IT governance. It could be supply chain governance, HR governance. There's layers of governance. What are the objectives? How are we reliably achieving those objectives? Then comes risk management, addressing uncertainty. What's the uncertainty in achieving those objectives? And then act with integrity. That's more than regulatory compliance. That's about also the integrity of the organization to its values, its ethics, its policies, its controls, its code of conduct. That what the organization communicates to the world, whether it's a regulator, a customer, a stakeholder, an investor, or an employee, that's what it really is in the organization. Compliance is about integrity. So putting this together in a flow, Governance sets direction and strategy for the organization to reliably achieve objectives. Governance functions, set that context for risk management. Without context, risk management fails. Again, the ISO 31000 definition of risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Risk management needs context. You don't just wake up someday and say, I feel like doing a risk assessment. But then the next question is, what do I do a risk assessment of? You need context to do a risk assessment. Governance provides the context to do a risk assessment. It's understanding what those objectives are that then we can assess the uncertainty in achieving those objectives that gives us context for that risk assessment. Risk management seeks to manage and understand uncertainty by identification, assessment, and monitoring of risk within the context to act on risk through 4 actions. When you have a risk, you can accept the risk as it is. You can possibly, but not always, avoid the risk. Where you make a decision where there's no longer a risk. We'll just go a different route. Or we can transfer the risk, like through hedging or insurance. But the one we focus on most often is mitigation of risk. Here's where the risk is, the inherent risk. Let's implement some controls, and here's where our residual risk will lie. And so we have 4 approaches to risk management there. We can accept, avoid, mitigate, or transfer. But then comes compliance. Compliance aims to see that the organization acts with integrity in fulfilling its regulatory, contractual, and self-imposed obligations and values. Compliance follows through on risk treatment plans to ensure that risk is being managed within limits and controls are in place and functioning. Think about it. Just as risk management is dependent on governance for context, risk management also needs compliance for follow-through. If I do this risk assessment and I say, here's my inherent risk over here, and I'm going to implement these controls to bring it to a residual risk here, and then I turn my back and go my way, who says those controls are implemented and they're being followed and they're working in the organization? Compliance needs to come in and ensure that those controls that we identified that we needed to address that risk are actually out there and operational and effective. Because just saying you need that control in a risk assessment does not mean that control is actually implemented or implemented properly. Compliance is the follow-through to make sure that we're staying within boundaries of what's acceptable risk and we're meeting those controls as well. It's much more than just regulatory compliance. And so the challenge that organizations face is they have the inevitability of failure of a lot of manual processes. Gosh, I'm dealing with this every day with organizations, documents, spreadsheets, and emails. One firm, for example, found out that they're building a report on compliance and risk for the board of directors. And it was taking them 200 hours to build this report every year on an annual basis, on average 200 hours, because everything was being managed in documents, spreadsheets, and emails. All these assessments had to gather information, tabulate, aggregate, report, and it took 200 hours to build, and then all find that they had some calculation error, and somewhere in the process, they got to go back and redo all of it. That's a mess. That same report now takes them less than a minute. And maybe we could say an hour if they have to tweak some things from whatever the report produces. But from 200 hours to, let's just give them some room because they told me a minute to an hour. That's a significant ROI and difference. Another firm, I was working on a RFP for a mid-sized bank, small to mid-sized bank. They did an internal study of their internal staff resources across audit, compliance, IT security, risk management. They found out that the staff in those 4 departments, 80% of their time was managing documents and not managing risk. They were document reconcilers and managers. They did an RFP to turn that completely around, where 80% of their time was actually trying to manage and improve risk, only 20%, reconciling information. And the other issue is documents, spreadsheets, and emails lack any type of audit trail or system of record. You can't say who did what, when, how, and why. Because there's no record of that. I fire off, if you do an assessment in a document or a spreadsheet, who's to say that somebody didn't come back the next week and change an answer to manipulate, to make the organization look better? I was talking to a regional bank in the Pacific Northwest. They went to GRC software in this space because the regulator was coming in. They're saying, you're not going to pass your next regulatory exam if you keep managing compliance and risk assessments in documents, spreadsheets, and emails. We want to see who did what, what day they answered that assessment question, what was assessed. If anybody came in and tweaked or modified anything, we want to see a system of record and audit trail because technology can deliver that now. Documents, spreadsheets, and emails, these manual processes are the inevitability of failure. So that means organizations are moving beyond this. We have seen new directions in GRC to enable risk management in the organization. From a past with a lot of fragmented silos that didn't talk to each other to a future of an integrated strategy across departments. We're not saying we create one mammoth department, but allow different departments to be able to work within the same process information technology architecture for governance, risk and compliance, or enterprise risk management, or ORM. I mean, that's another perspective I should state, is that everybody on the planet, every organization on the planet does GRC. GRC is actions and behaviors of the organization, how it's governed, how it takes and manages risk, how it's compliance. We didn't need software to come along to all of a sudden, oh, we now govern the organization. We now do risk assessments. We now do compliance. Software can enable and make things more efficient, effective, and agile. But every organization, whether they call it GRC or not, is doing GRC. It could be horrible. It could be like reactive firefighting, smoke and mirrors and fictitious and all this. But every organization has some approach to governance, risk, and compliance, whether they call it GRC, ERM, ORM, IRM, ABC, XYZ, or whatever it might be. And they might not even have a name for it. Every organization has some approach to governance, risk, and compliance. The question is, how can we make it more efficient, effective, and agile? And as I just stated, documents, spreadsheets, and emails don't get you there because that's the inevitability of failure. And there's software that can bring all this together to help us to move from that past to a future of an architected information technology architecture for governance, risk, and compliance within the organization. And so that's where we're moving. We're also moving from a past where there's a lot of responsibilities for aspects of GRC or risk management, and they could be passed around the organization like a hot potato sometimes. But the future is about accountability. You own this. You can outsource responsibility. I can give tasks to somebody else. When it comes to accountability, you can't give that to somebody else. When you have accountability, you have to own up to it. And we're seeing greater accountability in these areas. And so there's a lot of change right now. And so today's organization needs to be able to see the tree as well as the forest, the individual risk, as well as the interconnectedness of risks in the environment. Now, I get a lot of feedback on this slide. I teach a lot of risk management workshops out there, third-party risk workshops, policy workshops, and I have this slide in pretty much every one of my decks. And people love it, but I've also been challenged on it twice, both by banks, one in San Francisco and one in London. And they said the exact same thing. And they were just a month apart too, but different banks. They said, good analogy. We like the slide, but the reality is it's more than the tree and the forest. It's also the leaves and the branches. There's a lot that goes into that risk, that influence that risk. It's like chaos theory with the butterfly effect, where the butterfly effect is where you have the flutter of the butterfly wings in the Netherlands that makes the little flutter makes these tiny atmospheric changes that grow and grow and grow that can influence the development and path of a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. Those little things matter. I mean, you take the Target breach from 2014, for example. You know, the doorway into that breach was a HVAC vendor, a heating and air conditioning vendor that had a connection to the Target network for environmental monitoring. That HVAC vendor was targeted by a hacker and was able to jump across this network connection to Target and compromise point of sale systems. There's the casino in the United Kingdom that was breached by a video camera and a fish tank. Those little things matter. And we need, it's more than just the tree, but it's also those leaves and branches that can become the creation of that risk. So as I look at three strategic trends that I'm monitoring in governance, risk, and compliance in 2022, they come to agility, resiliency, and integrity. The agility is the ability to see the environment, to see what's coming at us, what we can call horizon scanning, not necessarily the here and now, but what's coming at us next week, next month, 3 or 6 months or next year. How are things developing in the economy and the regulatory environment? What's going to impact us? And the agility is the ability to navigate the environment, to optimize the organization. We see something coming, we prepare. We don't have issues because we're prepared. Or maybe we can even leverage it to our advantage for opportunity and risk management. Resiliency is that ability to recover quickly, ability to recover from events and get back in the game. Both these are very important, but they are different, but they're symbiotic. If you take an example of running, which both those previous slides, you can imagine that the guy was running. The agility is the ability to be able to see the obstacles that in front of us as we're running and be able to work around them or leap over them. Well, resilience is if I trip over that obstacle and fall flat on my face, how quickly can I get back up and running again? Organizations in their risk management program today need to be both agile and resilient. Agility is that ability to move quickly and easily, the ability to think and understand quickly. Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, toughness, the ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape, elasticity. I've been doing some evaluation of the operational resilience requirements and guidance around the world. In the United Kingdom, you have the FCA, PRA, Bank of England Operational Resilience Regulation, and we've got a deadline coming up for that in March of this year. In the EU, you've got DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act. And across the world, you've got Basel and the Bank for International Settlements and their definition of operational resilience. In the United States, you've got the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and their operational resilience guidance. You know which one I like the most? The United Kingdom's. It's the shortest definition of operational resilience, but it's the only one that brings in the idea of agility, not just resilience. You look at the US one is a pretty good definition because it tells you that resilience is the outcome of effective operational risk management. It's about bringing resilience and continuity into risk. But you look at the US, the EU, and the Basel Bank for International Settlements definition, and it's really all about resilience being the recovery from events. It's only the one in the United Kingdom where in the regulation it's asking and looking for how do you prevent events, not just recover from them or avoid events. So we need to be able to take a top-down as well as a bottom-up approach, where we have business agility and risk management, as well as operational resilience and risk. From the business top down, being able to understand the environment, what's coming at us, how do we leverage, how do we prepare? From the operational resilience, how do we prepare our systems, redundancy and recovery, and focus on those elements. Now, I talked about the two aspects of agility and resilience. The third thing that I'm monitoring in GRC in 2022 is integrity. Does the organization pretend it is something else? If we communicate to the world in our ESG, which is such a hot topic right now, environmental social governance, our code of conduct, our values, our ethics, our regulatory commitments and obligations, if we tell this to the world, is that who we really are? When we look in that corporate mirror, what we say we are is that's what is reflected back at us. That's integrity. And we're seeing a lot of focus on this, particularly with ESG right now. And you've got things like the Federal Reserve and the SEC and so many others putting some teeth into environmental social governance practices of organizations and financial services firms. This also means, as part of integrity, that we have accountability, which is different from responsibility. And I've already stated this, but responsibility, I can outsource. I can take tasks and give them to somebody else. I can take responsibilities and give them to somebody else. Accountability is the buck stops here. I might have told somebody else to do that, but if they don't do it, I have to answer for it still. That's accountability. Integrity requires that there's accountability for different areas of risk and compliance. And we're seeing this around the world with some of the accountability regimes in financial services, like the United Kingdom's SMCR, Senior Managers and Certification Regime, Ireland's SEER, Senior Executive Accountability Regime, Australia's what was BEAR, the Banking Executive Accountability Regime that's now become FEAR. That's the best name for a regulation I've ever encountered, the FEAR regulation, the Financial Executive Accountability Regime, Hong Kong's Managers in Charge, Singapore's Individual Accountability and Conduct Regime. It's all about accountability. Like in the United Kingdom, you have to have 28 senior management functions in different areas of risk. And if there's an issue, that senior management function, if there's willful wrongdoing, can go to jail. Or if there's misconduct, if there's negligence or lack of due diligence, they can be personally fined. Barclays' CEO was fined £640,000 for a whistleblower infraction that he had to pay out of his bank account, not the bank's bank account, because of UK SMCR. We're seeing greater accountability being focused on risk management in different domains and areas. We also see risk management collaboration on strategy, process, and technology is needed. Even if you have a chief risk officer, because we're talking about enterprise risk management today in a GRC context. If you have a chief risk officer, I've never met a chief risk officer where every area of risk has a direct report to the chief risk officer. Maybe some dotted lines and things, But the chief risk officer is really a facilitator of risk across a lot of departments, because you've got capital and treasury type risks like credit risk and market risk. You got a range of operational risks, which could be HR risks, IT risks, supply chain procurement risks, accounting risks, and so many more, environmental risks and health and safety risks. And all these operate in different parts of the organization. And they've gone about their own ways. And now we need to be able to see and work together. This means that we have to have a top-down approach, that we can bring together risk management strategy and what we're doing to address risk management, defining our risk management policy. And I worked with one Fortune 100 company in defining their enterprise risk management policy and what is, how do you define acceptable and unacceptable risk, and how do you provide risk collaboration and coordination and things. But that's the risk management strategy. Who's on the team? Who leads the team? But the team is a cross-functional, cross-department team. Who's on the team? How do they work together? What type of risk reports are needed? What does the board need to see for their fiduciary obligations to oversee risk management? That's all part of that strategy and coming together. And you have some type of charter for enterprise risk management, and you have that formulates that team that crosses departments, that's led by a chief risk officer of somebody similar title and role, and what the reporting structures are and what reports are needed, who, when, where, and how. And then this is all facilitated by risk management processes to identify risk, to assess risk, to treat risk, to monitor risk in the environment. Those are all risk management processes. And that risk management strategy and process is enabled by an information and technology architecture, like our host Zhorse today. So here's some questions to ask your organization in understanding risk management strategy drivers. What are the strategic, business, and regulatory drivers for risk management in your organization? What are the top risks and emerging risks facing the organization? Is it digital and security type risks? Is it ESG or like environmental risks? Is it health and safety risks? What is it? What risk could derail business strategy? What is the process to manage risk today? Is it sort of the Wild West out there where everybody's going different directions and nobody really has a full view of risk? What kinds of improvements are required and being contemplated? What distinctive competence can be gained by optimizing risk management in your organization? How will a risk management program and strategy help the organization improve business performance? Because at the end of the day, risk is about managing the uncertainty on objectives. That's performance. How will a risk management program gain visibility into risks across business units and IT and processes and projects and assets? And then governance, team, and collaboration on risk. Who are the current executive sponsors for risk management? How are they engaged to work collaboratively on a risk management program? What culturally and organizationally need to change to meet that vision from your current state to your future state? What kinds of skill sets are required to meet the vision? What other stakeholders could or should be driving the program? And what do you expect to get out of the program? This also means that, and I have a whole blog on this that I wrote, but if we're going to approach risk management, we need to think about it differently. We need the old ways of risk management. Those aren't going away. We still need them. And that's that left brain thinking on risk. You know, that's like our risk models that we have, whether we do Monte Carlo simulations, Bayesian modeling, or simply like heat maps and things like that. You know, we have some type of structured approach to risk management and how we've always looked at it. That's looking at risk inside the box. We create a box. This is some type of model of risk, you know, and that's where we do our risk identification and assessments. We're creating some box. But the problem with a box is that a box, and I'm using box as a synonym for a model, like a risk model, never accurately, completely represents the real world. The real world is very complex. And whatever box and attributes we measure of risk, they're limited. And they can't capture every variable in the real world. So sometimes we also need to think outside the box. So what I'm saying is we need our traditional left brain thinking on risk, where we have logical and structured thinking about risk management and our risk assessments and models. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle stated, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts." Data is great. Data is good. But we also need our right brain, the creative and imaginative thinking about risk management. You can use all the quantitative data you can get, but you still have to distrust it and use your own intelligence and judgment, says Alvin Toffler. I'm stating both are right for risk management. Good risk management in this navigating chaos age of ours requires structured thinking about risk on the left brain, but also creative thinking about risk on the right brain. Now, my family, my dad was an accountant, a CPA. My brother followed his footpath, went to Wharton, got a CPA, works at Microsoft now. They're left brain thinkers. I went the other route. I went to law school. I went to seminary. I like to think in words. I love English and I like visualizations. And I do a lot of my own graphics. You can see I like visual representation here. I like right brain thinking, or other people in my family like left brain. And good risk management can bring both together. We need left brain and right brain thinking on risk. Then we need to be able to monitor the change that impacts risk in our environment. We have to monitor the change in the external context, change in industry practices, changes in the laws and regulations and enforcement actions, shifts in economic situations and geopolitical risks that might tighten our credit risk policies, wherever they might be, changes in societal and environmental standards, shifts in technology or market or external views. But we also have to monitor the internal context, understand the governance and tone. What's the risk tolerance? What's acceptable and unacceptable risk in the environment? Do people understand that? Do they know how to make risk decisions? One of my favorite articles in this space was called Goldman Sachs Behind the Brass Plate in The Economist. Gosh, that was like 15 years ago. But it was really about Goldman Sachs risk management practices, in which if you were going to survive at Goldman Sachs and you had to make significant risk decisions were made as a team, a collaborative effort. They didn't tolerate people making risk decisions as a lone ranger out there. What's the strategic and operating plans and workforce culture, training, communication? All we have to monitor both this external and internal context. All this needs a risk management information architecture. What are our risks? Our strategic risks, our operational risks, our financial liquidity risks? How do those map to the objectives of the organization? Where do those risks map to the organizational structure? Is it an entity level risk? Is it a process level risk, an asset level risk? Like asset level risk could be like GDPR, privacy, like California CCPA and things. What are the regulatory risks and obligations? What about policies? You know, something organizations haven't done much of and just surprises me is map their policies to their risks. Every policy in the organization is essentially a risk document. We wouldn't have a policy if there wasn't a risk. And that risk was significant enough that somebody had to open up a word processor, sit down behind it, and write a policy to address that risk. But a lot of organizations don't even know what policies they have out there because they're scattered all over on different systems and different departments, let alone to go through the process of mapping their policies to their enterprise risk taxonomy or risk register. Who are the roles? Who's a subject matter expert on a risk? If that risk is changing and shifting, who can answer the questions on that? But then who's the risk owner out there that actually owns that risk? If that risk is actually materializes, who's bottom line? Who's accountable? That could be different from the subject matter expert. The subject matter expert's there to provide input, but the risk owner is somewhere out there in the business. What about that employee who's the risk taker, making risk decisions every day? You know, that it's not just the back office of risk management. We talk about the 3 lines model. You know, you've got the second line is risk management. The third line is audit and assurance, providing assurance on risk. The first line, we can't forget. They're the most important. That's where risk is being owned and taken day in and day out. That teller at the bank is making decisions on customer privacy, cash handling, fraud, money laundering every day. The doctor and nurse in a hospital are making patient decisions on patient safety and patient privacy every day. The coal miner in the coal mines making environmental and health and safety risk decisions every minute of every day. You know, we need to address the frontline employees as well. Issues, incidents, cases, investigations, complaints, you know, how do those map back to my risk? When we're doing like our simple heat map, we have likelihood and impact. Are we just pulling things out of thin air? Or are we actually going back and saying this risk is materialized this many times in the organization with this impact? Because we have good collection of our risk events that have come up, the investigations and incidents and cases, and we do our risk assessments. We have objective information that can fulfill like those likelihood or probability and impact areas because we have a good historical record of those events, how they've happened in the organization, but also in our industry. The controls that mitigate risk, are they in place? Are they effective? We need a solid information architecture that brings all this together. Now, if you're managing all these in little silos of documents, spreadsheets, and emails and homegrown systems and databases and things that don't talk to each other, you never become intelligent. You have a bunch of islands of data that don't gather for intelligence and knowledge. But when you bring together a solid risk information architecture, like our host Zhorse, you can then get to see these relationships and insights so you can be more intelligent. That allows us to bring in a lot of different data points on uncertainty and risk, integrate, map them together to provide context, understand relationships, and build out action items. Technology delivers for risk management, better management reporting, where it doesn't take 200 hours to build that report for the board. It's there to push of a button. We have a stronger audit trail and system of record of activities. And if somebody goes back, modifies, changes something, we have a complete audit trail and record of that. Strong workflow and tasks to make sure that assessments and things don't slip through the cracks. Better collaboration and enforcement. And we have modern technology. Now, GRC is a whole history. I have a whole presentation I can do from GRC 1.0 to 5.0. We are in that 4.0 to going to 5.0 right now. Now, legacy solutions that have been out there for 10, 15 years and haven't addressed their code base, they have a huge cost of ownership. Those systems, they get so much attention from my competitor analysts and things like that. Typically, for every dollar you spend in software, you're spending between $3 and $5 in implementation and build out. And have a huge cost of ownership. That's legacy software in this space. The modern agile software, governance, risk compliance, risk management software is highly usable for the back office as well as the front office. Has a lower total cost of ownership to implement and maintain, is highly configurable without customization that breaks things. It can scale, adapt, and integrate to the environment, provides analytics, and is moving towards that future of what I call GRC 5.0, cognitive GRC, and leveraging artificial intelligence and robotic process automation. It might not be there today, but it's starting to build towards that. And it's also future-proof, where things don't break on upgrades. I've talked to so many organizations in which the technology that they implemented for GRC, ERM, they're stuck on it because they implement it, they customize it so much, and to get to the next version, it's like a whole new install and migration and not just an upgrade. It's crazy. You know, agile technology is future-proof. You're always on the current code set. And the benefits of automating risk management with GRC technology, I break down into 3 areas: efficiency, effectiveness, and agility. These are the 3 areas that I build business cases for organizations. Efficiency is time saved, money saved. Before, it took us 200 hours to do that risk report. Now it takes us an hour. That's a ROI calculation you do right there. Before, 80% of our staff time was managing documents. Now only 20% is reconciling information. 80% is like managing risk. Effectiveness is greater accuracy, better audit trail, system of records, less audit findings, nothing slipping through the cracks. And agility is being able to keep up with all this risk, regulatory, and business change and keep it all in sync and not just be agile, but also be resilient so that when we have issues, we can recover from them. So in context of bringing this together, we have an environment that demands that we become more aware of all these islands of risk and how they impact each other. You know, my quote from the physicist Friedrich Capra earlier: the more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are interconnected. We need to see these risk relationships. This allows us to align our different risk teams and work together collaboratively to identify what's coming at us and be responsive to issues so that we can recover from them quickly, and prepare the organization so that we are agile and resilient, but do so in a way that we're also efficient in our use of human capital and financial capital resources. So with that, I'm going to turn this back over to our host, Zhorse, to conclude us for the day.
Thank you, Michael. And please leave this slide up, because I took 3 pages of notes just from listening to you today. So I know that our audience has taken a lot of notes as well. They'll probably reach out to you directly to get some more additional insight. Absolutely, really appreciate your efforts today. A dynamite presentation, a lot of valuable information. So thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
And to the audience out there, we are going to have a part 2 with Michael. We're going to be coming up here shortly. So make sure you look out for that. We're going to do a fireside chat kind of situation where we ask him lots of questions that both Juan and I have, and that some of our friends in the industry have asked us as well. And we're going to run those by Michael and see what his insights provide us from that perspective. Thank you so much, everyone. And we will see you on another occasion, part 2.
Thank you very much.